Let's now take a look at reversal formations. Here in the chart, we can directly identify several reversal formations. We would like to discuss an Adam and Eve pattern, which we have down here, and also a classic head and shoulders formation, which we find up here. Let's first examine the complete chart to uncover some chart logic. These gaps or price gaps can also be helpful here. It's important to note that price gaps are generally filled at some point. Crucially, this process can sometimes take a while. These price gaps do not necessarily get filled immediately. What we want to look at first is the situation down here, where we can recognize a so-called Adam and Eve pattern. An Adam and Eve pattern is a V-shaped chart formation initially, and in the second phase we can identify the Eve pattern, from which we observe an arc in the chart, specifically this one here. This particular chart formation somewhat resembles the cup and handle pattern. However, it is typically easier to recognize because we are working with this distinctive arc. You can immediately see that this is a breakout setup. I will briefly remove this to draw the breakout line. For instance, we can use the starting point of the gap, as we notice that we frequently have a resistance area here, particularly in this region around the gap. Now, what do we need to do to confirm a breakout with this Adam and Eve pattern? It's always great when we have such a strong breakout. We must be aware that there is a thick and thin Eve here. A thick Eve is usually formed a bit further down, which leads to me wanting to run below this white signal line again. So how can we use this to determine a price target? We need to measure the height from the Adam in the first part up to this breakout level. We refer to this height as H. We can then essentially place this tool on top of it. Now we have what's called a projection here as well. As you may have noticed, projections are very common in technical chart analysis, as they are usually just extensions. So using the first projection, which we call H1, or more precisely little h1, we can determine the target areas. After the pattern here has played out, there is a further possibility of a so-called second projection. For this, we draw from the low point to the high point, which we derive via this H1 projection. Well, we can then use that to put another target area or target area scenario into the chart, which also allows us to determine a chrome price target up here. This second projection, which we call H2, is then the second plot, which we also generally mark with a capital letter. The middle areas here of this pattern usually provide a support area, which often becomes interesting after the pullback. All we have to do here is simply draw a line from the midpoint over here, and we can then deal with the next situation here. Now that we have drawn our situation with Adam and Eve, let's move on to the next very well-known reversal formation. We can also see here again that we have a level that is significant. We can draw a line here at this level. Of course, you always have to know that we can't see this conclusion here yet. However, it is the case that we can recognize a classic head and shoulders formation here at this high. So this is a head and shoulders formation. We would have the first arc here, then we would have the second and the third here. It would be the case that the situation allows us to name it nicely again. This here is a shoulder. Then we have another shoulder right here. And here in the middle is the highest breakout, which is of course the head, or simply the head in English. How can you now derive a scenario with this formation, the head and shoulders formation, and once again set a price target using the tools in the chart? On the one hand, we have our breakout level here, and it also works here as follows. We work with a box projection again, namely, we take the height from the head and underline it by inserting it below the breakout, so that we are at this level, and we can also determine our first take profit here, which we would have worked through in this area. And then there would also be a retest here, so to speak, which is preferred by technical analysts to confirm this situation. In this case, you can also take a second projection here. To do this, we'll take the box that we've already drawn and place it underneath again, so that we can essentially add a second retracement projection to the chart, which explains where this low originates from. Of course, it's also possible to work with the setups or tools that I introduced in the first video. Let's remove this line, and these labels are a bit distracting at the moment. As we've already discussed, there's also the possibility of using what's called a wolf pattern here. We'll take a sequential line again and overlay it here. You could also place it up here. That would work too. However, the signal would be relatively weak in that case. So then, it's also possible to derive this target below 0.4 using a wolf projection on the chart. What else could potentially help in this situation? Again, it would be possible to use a trendline projection to determine a low point. On one hand, we can use this small stretch to identify the intermediate level here. But even in a larger fractal, this decline would be possible where we can work with a simple projection to reach a rough price target down here. Now let's reflect on the reversal situation. I need to briefly clean up the chart for this. We could also derive it using a wolf line, which we can add to the chart. This would then help us derive a rising price target. Always be aware of the open gaps that are present. They often provide information that the price may still want to close them. Later on, we can also see that, by and large, even this open gap here is finally closed, although relatively late. I hope this was able to shed some light on how you can deal with simple reversal formations on the chart. Of course, the relationship of the head and shoulders pattern here is particularly interesting.